At Ethan's company party, the mood was electric, colleagues mingling over laughter and clinking glasses, the ambience glowing under soft golden lights. The gathering was a blend of personal and professional, a celebration of a recent project milestone. Ethan, a meticulous software engineer, stood near the bar nursing a glass of whiskey. He scanned the room for Rachel, his wife, a vivacious marketing executive with a knack for charming a crowd. She was at the center of a lively group, her bright laughter carrying over the noise. Ethan admired her from a distance, pride warming him. She had always been magnetic, drawing people in effortlessly. Among the crowd was Chris, their mutual friend, a fitness trainer known for his easy confidence and sharp wit. Chris had always been friendly, sometimes a little too much for Ethan's liking, but he shrugged it off. After all, Chris was married to his job, perpetually unattached. An hour into the evening, Ethan stepped outside to take a call. When he returned, Rachel and Chris were nowhere in sight. He wandered through the clusters of people, eventually spotting them on the patio. He paused. They stood close, closer than seemed necessary, and Chris was leaning in, speaking softly. Rachel threw her head back, laughing at something he said, her hand brushing his arm. It was an innocuous scene on the surface, but Ethan's stomach tightened. Was he overthinking it? The night progressed, and Ethan noticed more peculiar interactions. Rachel and Chris exchanged glances across the room, each one lingering longer than the last. When Ethan approached, the dynamic shifted. Rachel grew quiet, and Chris excused himself. The unease gnawed at Ethan, but he resolved to let it go, chalking it up to paranoia. Later, as the party wound down, Ethan noticed Rachel was missing again. This time, a gnawing suspicion drove him to search for her. He headed upstairs, past a series of offices, his footsteps muffled by the carpet. Voices reached him, Rachel's low, hurried tones and Chris's deeper one. They were in a small, dimly lit conference room, the door ajar. Ethan froze at the threshold, his breath catching. Rachel stood pressed against the wall, her face flushed. Chris leaned in, his hand resting above her head. Their conversation was indistinct, but their body language spoke volumes. Ethan's presence went unnoticed for a moment, giving him enough time to process the scene. His heart pounded, his hands trembling as he gripped the doorframe. Rachel? His voice cut through the charged air. They jumped apart like guilty teenagers caught sneaking out. Rachel's eyes widened in shock, while Chris quickly masked his expression with a calm, unconvincing smile. Ethan? Rachel stammered, her voice higher than usual. Chris and I were talking about… Talking? Here? Ethan's voice was sharp, the hurt evident. What could possibly require this level of privacy? Chris held up his hands defensively. Ethan, it's not what it looks like, man. We were just… Save it? Ethan's voice broke slightly, and he hated himself for the vulnerability it revealed. His eyes locked onto Rachel's, searching for answers she wasn't offering. The tension was suffocating. Rachel reached out, but Ethan stepped back. Don't, he said firmly, his voice steadying. I can't believe this. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Ethan drove home in silence, Rachel sitting beside him, her explanations tripping over themselves but never quite landing. At home, the confrontation was inevitable. Rachel finally admitted to the growing closeness between her and Chris but swore it hadn't gone further. Ethan's mind replayed the scene over and over, his trust eroding with each iteration. The betrayal was raw, and the questions were endless. How long had this been going on? Had he been blind to it all this time? Ethan felt the foundation of their marriage crack under the weight of doubt and betrayal. The night marked the beginning of a rift that would not easily mend. We arrived home in a silence so dense it felt like a tangible barrier between us. Rachel tried to fill the void with an explanation before I could even close the front door. Her voice was rushed, almost frantic, but her words didn't register as I walked past her and into the kitchen. I needed a drink, something to calm the storm raging in my head. I poured a glass of water instead of whiskey, not trusting myself with anything stronger. Ethan, please, she started again, following me. It wasn't what it looked like. I swear. Chris and I were just talking, about work, about life. It was nothing. Her voice trembled, and I could tell she was trying to sound earnest. But there was something about the way she spoke, like she was choosing her words too carefully, that made my skin crawl. I took a long sip, staring at the counter, refusing to meet her eyes. I wasn't ready to face her yet. Nothing, I finally said, my voice low, steady, but cold. I turned to her, and her expression flickered with unease. You call that nothing? The way you were standing so close? Laughing at every word he said, sneaking off to be alone? If that's nothing, Rachel, I'd hate to see what something looks like. Her face crumpled, and she let out a frustrated sigh. You're blowing this out of proportion. Chris is a friend, our friend. You know that. I would never. Don't, I interrupted sharply, slamming the glass on the counter harder than I intended. Don't insult me by pretending I didn't see what I saw. You didn't even bother to hide it, Rachel. You two were practically flaunting it right in front of me. She flinched at my words but quickly recovered, her tone shifting. I wasn't flaunting anything, Ethan. You're acting like I've done something horrible, but I haven't. Chris and I were just talking. That's it? Talking? I spat. Talking doesn't require that kind of body language, Rachel. Talking doesn't make you forget you have a husband standing a few feet away. And talking sure as hell doesn't lead to sneaking off to an empty room upstairs. She folded her arms defensively, her eyes narrowing. I don't know what you expect me to say. You're seeing things that aren't there. There it was, that subtle twist. She wasn't taking responsibility, she was shifting the blame. My chest tightened as the realization sank in. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done, she was sorry I'd caught her. Don't do that, I said quietly, shaking my head. Don't turn this around on me. I didn't imagine the way you were with him tonight. I didn't imagine the way you looked at him. Her eyes welled up, and she threw her hands in the air. Fine. Yes, I've been leaning on Chris a bit lately. Work has been stressful, and you've been so distant. He's been a good listener, someone I can talk to when I need to vent. But that doesn't mean I'm cheating on you. Her words hit me like a blow. She was trying to justify it, as if her actions were somehow my fault. I could feel my anger bubbling just beneath the surface, but I forced myself to stay calm. Distant? I echoed, my voice eerily calm. You think I've been distant? Do you have any idea how hard I've been working to give us the life we have? All those late nights, all the stress. It's for us, Rachel. For you. And while I've been killing myself trying to keep everything afloat, you've been cozying up to Chris because I didn't listen to you complain about your job? Her face turned red, and she looked away, biting her lip. She had no answer, at least not one she wanted to say out loud. I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. You want to talk about distance? How about the fact that you couldn't even bother to talk to me about whatever you're feeling? Instead, you go to Chris. Do you know what that does to me? To us? She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with something that looked like regret. I didn't mean for it to get like this, Ethan. I didn't realize. I didn't think it was a big deal. A big deal, I repeated, my voice flat. You didn't think sneaking around with another man was a big deal. I wasn't sneaking around, she snapped, her voice rising. If I was doing something wrong, I wouldn't have done it at a party full of people who know us. And I wouldn't have let you see me with him. Her logic was infuriating. So what? You're saying I should feel better because you weren't hiding it? That makes it okay? She groaned, pressing her palms to her forehead. I don't know what you want me to say, Ethan. I'm telling you the truth. Nothing happened between me and Chris. I made a mistake, but it wasn't what you think. Her words were hollow, lacking the conviction I needed to hear. They felt rehearsed, calculated to placate me rather than address the real issue. And maybe that was the worst part, the realization that even now, after everything, she was still holding something back. I don't know if I can believe you, I said finally, my voice breaking. You've already crossed a line, Rachel. And trust, it doesn't just come back because you say the right words. Her face crumpled, and she stepped closer, reaching for me. Ethan, please. Don't do this. Don't push me away. But I stepped back, the gap between us growing wider in more ways than one. I'm not pushing you away, Rachel. You did that all on your own. Rachel didn't give up. As much as I wanted to walk away from the argument, she followed me into the living room. Her voice had shifted now, no longer pleading or apologetic. It was sharper, more pointed. I could feel the shift in the air, the way the tension seemed to crystallize into something darker. "You know what, Ethan?" she began, her tone biting. "Maybe if you weren't so wrapped up in your work, this wouldn't have happened. Have you ever thought about that?" I stopped pacing, turning to face her. The audacity of her words hit me like a slap. "Are you seriously trying to pin this on me?" I asked incredulously. "I'm not pinning anything on you," she snapped back, her hands on her hips. "I'm just saying, maybe if you paid more attention to me, I wouldn't have had to go to Chris for support." Her words hung in the air, their sting sinking deeper than I wanted to admit. "Support?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You needed support? From Chris? You have a husband, Rachel. You're supposed to come to me if you need support, not him." Her laugh was cold, humorless. "All right. Because you're so emotionally available, aren't you? Let's be honest, Ethan. You've been checked out of this marriage for months, maybe years. All you care about is your stupid deadlines and your job. Meanwhile, I'm here, trying to keep everything together while you're married to your laptop." My jaw tightened as I struggled to keep my temper in check. "You think I don't care about this marriage? About you? Every late night, every hour I spend busting my ass, is for us, Rachel. For you. Don't stand there and tell me I'm not invested." "Invested?" she shot back. "When's the last time we had a real conversation? When's the last time you looked at me, not just glanced, but really looked at me? I can't even remember the last time we sat down and talked about anything that wasn't work or bills." Her accusations felt like a punch to the gut. But as much as they hurt, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was twisting the narrative to suit her own needs. "And sneaking around with Chris was your solution?" I countered. "That's how you fix things, by running to another man?" She rolled her eyes, exasperated. "For the last time, I wasn't sneaking around. And nothing happened. But honestly, Ethan, can you blame me for wanting someone to talk to? Someone who actually listens? Don't act like I don't listen to you," I shot back. "Just because I'm not hanging on your every word doesn't mean I don't care. I've been trying, Rachel. But you didn't even give me a chance." Her arms crossed over her chest, her body language screaming defiance. "You're so good at making yourself the victim, aren't you? Poor Ethan, working so hard for his ungrateful wife. Did it ever occur to you that maybe I've been trying too? That maybe I'm just as frustrated as you are?" "Frustrated?" I echoed, my voice dripping with disbelief. "You're frustrated? You don't get to play that card, Rachel. Not after tonight. Not after everything I saw." "You're impossible," she muttered, throwing her hands in the air. "No matter what I say, you've already made up your mind. You're so determined to be the wounded party that you can't see anything else." I shook my head, laughing bitterly. "This isn't about me being the victim, Rachel. This is about you breaking my trust. And instead of owning up to it, you're deflecting, twisting this into some sob story about how I wasn't there for you. Because you weren't," she fired back. Her voice cracked, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of vulnerability beneath her anger. "You weren't there, Ethan. You've been so focused on your work, on everything else, that I felt like a ghost in my own marriage. Do you have any idea how lonely that is?" I stared at her, my own anger colliding with a pang of guilt I didn't want to acknowledge. "And you think I haven't felt lonely?" I asked quietly. "Do you think it's been easy for me? Trying to juggle everything, trying to keep us afloat while I what?" she demanded, her voice rising again. "Go on, Ethan. Say it. While I talk to Chris. While I confide in someone who actually makes me feel seen." Seen? The word tasted bitter on my tongue. "You want to talk about being seen? How about the fact that every time I come home, you're glued to your phone, barely looking up when I walk through the door? Don't act like this is all on me, Rachel." Her face flushed, and she opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off. "You want to blame me for being distant? Fine. I'll take some of that blame. But don't you dare use that as an excuse for what you've done. This isn't about my work or my deadlines. This is about you making a choice. A selfish, reckless choice." For a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of our words hanging heavy between us. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with something I couldn't quite place. regret, anger, maybe even shame. But whatever it was, it didn't change the fact that the damage had been done. I don't know how we come back from this, I said finally, my voice low and hollow. You've broken something, Rachel. And I don't think it can be fixed with words. Her lip trembled, but she quickly masked it with a defiant glare. Maybe you're right, she said coldly. Maybe it can't. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the middle of a living room that suddenly felt like a battlefield. The argument left me feeling hollow, but the anger and suspicion wouldn't let me rest. Something about Rachel's defense didn't sit right with me. She was too defensive, too quick to shift the blame, and the more I replayed her words, the less I believed her. I needed answers, real answers. Not her justifications, not her evasions. Cold hard facts. It started that night. While Rachel slept upstairs, I sat in the dim light of the living room, scrolling through my phone. My mind raced, thinking of all the times she'd been glued to her phone lately, her laughter at texts she wouldn't share, the late nights when she claimed she was catching up on work. My chest tightened as the thought solidified. What if she wasn't just leaning on Chris emotionally? What if it was more? I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt. I needed proof, one way or another. I didn't want to snoop through her phone, but when trust is gone, privacy feels like a luxury you can't afford. So I waited. Early the next morning, while she was in the shower, I found her phone on the nightstand. My heart pounded as I unlocked it. She wasn't smart enough to change her password. What I saw confirmed what I feared. There were texts between her and Chris, but they weren't incriminating at first glance. They talked about mundane things. Work, fitness, mutual friends. But the tone of the messages felt off. Too playful, too familiar. And then I scrolled back further. That's when I found it. Chris, last night was something else. I can't stop thinking about it. Rachel, me neither. We need to be more careful, though. Ethan is starting to notice. My stomach twisted as I read the words. Starting to notice? More careful? I scrolled further, my hands trembling. The messages were scattered, careful not to say too much, but the implications were clear. Late night meetups, excuses to spend time together, thinly veiled references to the other night. My head spun as I pieced it all together. This wasn't just emotional. It was physical. I felt sick. The betrayal was worse than I imagined, and yet I needed more. I didn't know why. Maybe because a part of me still hoped I was wrong, that I was reading too much into it. Or maybe I just wanted enough evidence to confront her without giving her room to deny it. The next opportunity came a week later. Chris and I happened to be at the same bar, a coincidence that I almost didn't believe. Rachel wasn't with us. She'd claimed she was working late. Chris, always the social butterfly, had a beer in hand and was laughing with some mutual friends. But I could tell he'd already had more than enough to drink. I played it cool at first, casually joining their group. Chris was his usual charming self, cracking jokes and throwing back drinks like they were water. But as the night wore on, he started to unravel. His speech slurred, his laughter too loud, and he began to overshare. It started innocently enough, stories about clients, gym mishaps, things that wouldn't raise an eyebrow. But then his tone shifted and he leaned closer to me. "Nathan," he said, his words dragging slightly. "You're lucky to have Rachel. 'Tis something else." I stiffened but kept my voice even. "Yes, she is." He laughed, a little too hard. "She's just so easy to talk to, you know? Makes you feel like you're the only person in the room." There was something in the way he said it that made my skin crawl. "She's always been good at that," I said cautiously. He nodded, his head bobbing like a puppet on loose strings. "Yeah, she's great. I mean, sometimes, maybe too great." He laughed again, this time nervously, and took another swig of his beer. "You ever feel like you don't deserve her?" My stomach turned, but I forced a smile. "Why would you say that?" Chris hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. "I don't know, man. Just, she's special, you know? I don't blame you for being mad about the other night." My pulse quickened. "What about the other night?" His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, I thought he'd sober up on the spot. But the alcohol had its grip on him, and he chuckled, shaking his head. "Ah, forget I said anything. I'm drunk." Ignore me. But I didn't ignore it. I pressed. No, seriously. What do you mean? What happened the other night? Chris looked at me, his expression a mix of guilt and confusion. I'm just saying, you should probably talk to Rachel. That's all. I clenched my fists under the table, my nails digging into my palms to keep myself from reacting. Right? I said flatly, standing up. Thanks for the advice. I left the bar before I did something I'd regret. My heart was racing, my mind a blur of anger and disbelief. Between the texts and Chris's drunken confession, I had all the proof I needed. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't misinterpretation. Rachel had crossed every line. Back home, I stared at my phone, screenshots of their messages staring back at me like a taunt. I thought about what to do next, how to confront her, how to handle the fallout. But one thing was clear, there was no salvaging the trust she'd destroyed. And no amount of manipulation or excuses was going to change that. I spent the night replaying the events over and over, my anger building with every thought. The messages, Chris's drunken confession, it all painted a picture that I couldn't ignore. I had the truth now, and the time for avoidance was over. Rachel had made her choices, and now she was going to face the consequences. The next morning, I waited for her at the kitchen table, the evidence spread out in front of me. Screenshots of their texts, printed copies from her phone, and notes I'd made from Chris's drunken ramblings. She came downstairs, still groggy, her hair a mess. She froze when she saw me sitting there, her eyes darting to the pile of papers on the table. What's all this? She asked, her voice hesitant. Sit down, I said, my tone cold and unyielding. Her hesitation lasted only a second before she sat across from me, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Ethan, what's going on? I picked up the first page and slid it across the table. It was a screenshot of her text exchange with Chris, the one where she admitted they needed to be more careful. Her face went pale and she glanced up at me, her lips parting as if to speak, but I cut her off. Don't even try to deny it, I said firmly. I've got more. Enough to prove exactly what's been going on between you and Chris. She swallowed hard, her face shifting between guilt and defiance. You went through my phone, she said, her voice rising. How dare you? How dare I? I snapped, slamming my hand on the table. Don't you dare turn this around on me. You're the one who's been sneaking around, lying to me, betraying me. I had every right to find out the truth when you wouldn't give it to me. Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for the right words, but nothing came out. I didn't give her time to recover. I talked to Chris, I continued. He wasn't as careful with his words as you were. He admitted enough to confirm everything I already knew. So don't waste my time with excuses. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she buried her face in her hands. Ethan, I didn't mean for it to happen, she choked out. I was lonely, I was confused. You were selfish, I interrupted. You didn't care about how your actions would affect me, or us. You just did what felt good in the moment. She sobbed harder, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. Not anymore. And the worst part, I said, my voice breaking slightly despite myself, is that you didn't even stop. Even when you knew I was catching on, you just kept lying. I didn't know what else to do, she cried. I was scared, Ethan. Scared of losing you. Losing me? I laughed bitterly. You lost me the second you decided to run to him instead of me. Don't pretend this was about saving our marriage. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know I messed up. But please, Ethan, don't let this ruin us. We can fix it. We can go to counseling, we can... Stop, I said, holding up a hand. Just stop. We're past that now. You didn't just hurt me. You broke something that can't be fixed. I stood up, gathering the papers into a folder. I'm done protecting your lies, Rachel. I'm done letting you control the narrative. Our friends, our family, they deserve to know the truth. She looked panicked. Ethan, no. Please, don't bring them into this. This is between us. It stopped being just between us the moment you involved Chris, I shot back. And they deserve to know who you really are. I didn't wait for her response. I spent the rest of the day reaching out to people, our closest friends, her family, even Chris's acquaintances. I didn't embellish or dramatize. I simply laid out the facts. I showed them the messages, recounted Chris's confession, and let the evidence speak for itself. The reactions were immediate. Most of our friends were stunned, some angry, others sympathetic. Chris's reputation took a hit just as hard as Rachel's, and his attempts to downplay what had happened only made him look worse. By the end of the day, the truth had spread like wildfire. Rachel's parents called me that evening, devastated. They apologized profusely for her actions, saying they never thought she was capable of something like this. Her father sounded particularly broken, his voice heavy with disappointment. "We'll talk to her," he said, his tone firm. "She needs to understand what she's done." My own family was nothing but supportive. My sister called, offering a place to stay if I needed it. My parents expressed their pride in how I'd handled everything, saying I deserved better than what Rachel had given me. By the end of the week, Rachel's lies had completely unraveled. She tried to salvage what she could, reaching out to people to defend herself, but the evidence was too damning. Every denial she made only pushed people further away. Even Chris stopped backing her up, likely to save his own skin. The confrontation had been brutal, but it gave me a strange sense of closure. I didn't feel victorious or vindicated, just tired. Tired of the lies, the manipulation, the constant questioning of my own reality. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. Rachel stayed in the house for a few more days, but the tension was unbearable. Eventually, she packed a bag and left, saying she needed time to think. I didn't try to stop her. There was nothing left to say.